Hi, I'm Johnny Carroll Sane, and welcome to Round the Fire on EarthX. Today, my guests are Chad Schmuckler, managing editor of Hatch Fly Fishing Magazine. Hi, Chad. Thanks for sitting down with us.
Thanks for having me.
And my second guest is Andrew McKean. He's the hang editor for Outdoor Life, and I'm really kind of surprised that he was able to find time in the middle of October to sit down and visit.
Me too. This is very provisional. I could go at any minute.
I understand. I want to get this out of the way too, because the pre-rut's about to get good here. And so I want to get this out of the way, because the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'm going to be hopefully sitting in a tree. Today, what we're going to talk about is the responsibility of outdoor media. And where I'm coming from this is, do traditional hook and bullet publications cover environmental and public land issues with the depth and earnestness that they should? What are the responsibilities of the outdoor media in regards to environmental and public lands issues, especially since this pairing is the bedrock of hunting heritage, of our current hunting culture, and for the future of hunting and angling? And the angling's part of that too. I know I just mentioned hunting and angling going forward.
Well, I've been thinking about that question for a couple of weeks since you broached it, and I would actually say no. There's so many ways to go, but I'm going to say no. Outdoor journalism is not living up to the promise of comprehensively covering the outdoors and environmental issues, especially very controversial outdoor issues, for its audience. I want to come back to a couple of things though, and I would say I don't know that it was ever actually intended that way. I look back. So Outdoor Life has been in publication since 1898. Interestingly, we can talk about this a little bit. We just got sold last week to an equity partnership. So there's a little bit of question going forward what that looks like. But I would say in that 122 year run, there have been some great advocacy pieces done. And I would say that we still do great advocacy pieces, but advocacy is not journalism. And I think we need to make a bright line between those two things. So I would say in terms of journalistic tenets of objectivity and deeply reporting on issues, no, I don't think we do a good job. And I say that as a newspaper man who has sort of shouldered my way into the outdoor world. We can continue that later, but that's sort of my opening statement.
Okay. Chad, what are your thoughts?
No, generally we don't. Although we may not see eye to eye completely on how they don't do a good job. Andrew mentioned that, at least I think what you were getting at, Andrew, is that in your view, the main job there is to address these issues in depth, to provide readers with a real detailed view, to allow them to fully understand these topics. And I think that's part of it. I think that's at least maybe, let's say, half the picture. But I think where Andrew and I would differ maybe is that I do think it's equally the responsibility when presenting those cases to build advocacy and teach people how to get involved in these issues and to some degree teach stewardship in the context of these issues.
I don't think we're that far apart. In fact, I think we actually do a good job of being advocates for not only appropriate use and responsible use of resources, but also for getting engaged in a political process that then influences the public policy around those issues. So I think we're saying the same thing there. Where I have a big bone in my throat when it comes to kind of my peer group, and this is, I came up into this world as a weekly newspaper reporter and then a daily newspaper editor, and then moved into magazines. And I would say in general, unless it's a magazine that is sort of topically focused on current issues and having the resources to deeply report issues, that's a whole other thing I'd like to talk about. Is in terms of the resources to do this, it's not easy. But magazines in general, especially sort of enthusiast magazines across the spectrum, don't do a very good job of deeply reporting issues. And in some ways, I don't think it's their job. Where I have waded into the world, so I look at my beat really as the Interior Department in some cases. We did a pretty deeply reported profile of Ryan Zinke when he was Secretary of the Interior that was, I think, surprising to a lot of our readers, because it sort of showed him in an unvarnished light of who this person is. And and what his motivations were as a steward of our public resources. It surprised people because that was stepping out of, I think, a little bit of the expected role of outdoor magazines, which is, I would say, to promote useful knowledge of how to use gear and how to kind of basically the sort of how-to model of how to be an effective outdoors person. And also be a bit of an apologist for the industry that supports this whole thing. So the gun industry, the angling industry, sort of what I call the whitetail industrial complex of America. And those are real issues and sort of headwinds that I think resist some of that deep reporting.
When you talk about, do we do a good job? We can talk about what each publication's motivations are, where their comfort zone is, what topics they choose to tackle. But as you alluded, a lot of the failure to do this job and do it well across, I think, the entire industry is, as you said, because it takes a lot of resources to do this work and do it well. You need quite a bit of, money, for lack of, better explanation. And that's something that each day that goes by, each year that goes by, outdoor publications have less and less of. I mean, it's just the nature of the business these days. And so whether a lot of these publications, I can speak for myself, and it's not always a question of will or interest or ability. It's often simply a question of resources.
I think about, so I was formerly the editor-in-chief of Outdoor Life, and within that time period, I probably made half a dozen to 8 hires. And in some cases, I'm looking for somebody who is nimble with all kinds of content, whether that be digital content or can turn a phrase that then it can be produced into a print piece, sure. And who knows sort of their beat. But I would say that the audience expectation is that somebody who's going to cover, let's say, fishing as a department columnist for Field and Stream and Outdoor Life isn't being hired because they're great, resourceful journalists. They're being hired because they're good anglers. I look at some of the enthusiast magazine sort of peer groups, and I think it's a little bit different in our world. So, I look at Car and Driver and sort of some of the automotive titles. The people who are covering automotive, like high-end race cars, are not racers. They're just people who are good at learning about cars and then reporting to a general audience. That's a little bit different, at least in my perspective of the skill set we're hiring for. And it's people who are, if not experts, at least very familiar with these narrow topics. I think in some ways it's an expectation to think that an outdoor journalist working for Outdoor Life is going to deeply cover environmental issues. I wish it wasn't.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't that to some degree still a resource issue? I mean, if Outdoor Life or Hatch Magazine or any of these outdoor publications had the resources, and there was room on staff for someone who may not be a good angler or who may not, that's not one of their passions, but still in the newsroom, their skill set is environmental reporting, and they're there to cover the topics in that way from the outdoor perspective. Because certainly, in my experience from environmental reporting or conservation reporting or whatever you want to call it, there's a way that outdoor and an angle and a lens through which outdoor publications view those issues that's very different from the way that a traditional environmental interested publication or an environmental advocacy group would. And so to me, that's where, with greater resources, having someone with those talents or having the ability to bring in people with those talents would lead to a whole different kind of journalism that I think is lacking out there.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys remember Bob Marshall, but he was the longtime environmental and kind of issues columnist for Field and Stream. He was also the environmental reporter for the New Orleans Times-Picayune. You're exactly right, Chad. Resources being what they were at the time, we could afford to retain somebody who wrote a monthly column and deeply reported on environmental issues. On the outdoor side, Outdoor Life side, that was George Geiger, who had that same sort of beat for a long time. So it really was the lack of resources or the sort of atrophying of resources that ended the justification for that beat. And they did a good job. So, 2 years ago, no, it was last year, how time flies. I went to Florida to basically do an enterprise piece on looking at all of the myriad problems with Florida's water issues. I mean, everything from leaking septic tanks to what's going on in the Everglades with sugarcane processing to the red tide. And it was, you know, statewide. I spent 2 weeks in Florida. Interviewed probably 25 people. I mean, it was a fascinating piece. And I think we presented it really well. That was expensive as hell, you know, and it wasn't that we were going to lose advertisers because of that depth of coverage, but it was something I could only do in February because, as Johnny mentioned, hunting season has got me pretty occupied elsewhere. And it was something that it was sort of an opportunity cost. There were other things I could not cover because I did that.
Sure. And how often, you know, can you do those pieces? Even when you can, even if you fit in one here and there, it's not something that outdoor publications these days have the ability to, you know, have one a month even on the docket. It's the resources just aren't there. So, I mean, but again, I think that's half the picture, right? I mean, I think on one side, you know, if you want to look overall at the failure that we all seem to agree exists in the outdoor media community on covering these issues, specifically sporting publications, I think lack of resources is half of it. But I think the other half is an unwillingness to tackle some of these issues, or at least an unwillingness to tackle them in depth, to present a real case to the reader, to not do more than simply report on the news bullet points, you know, a very short version summarizing what's happening, but really not providing the kind of analysis or interpretation that journalists are here to do, you know.
From the reader's perspective, are you guys getting feedback? Are readers wanting more of this information? Is anybody calling for it?
From Hatch Magazine's perspective, you know, I think people in general imagine that there's more reader feedback for publications than there are. Certainly, we all get some, but it's not like we're digging out from under piles of fan mail or reader mail or letters to the editor every week. But there's certainly a steady flow that comes in. And I could say, you know, in terms of, you know, you have different kinds of content. You have the gear reviews and the how-tos and the stuff like that, you know, virtually every editor in the outdoor media business will tell you pays the bills. And those are the ones that get read the most. But in terms of what drives reader feedback, I don't get thank you letters about, you know, the review we did of the latest hot rod, or tips on how to get better traction with your wading boots. You know, what we get thank you letters, and it's many of which are people taking the time to write, you know, heartfelt commentary, are on the conservation pieces. Far and away, it's the reporting and the journalism we do, and the stuff that people seem to have the impression on their end that at least they consider it, you know, that we're taking a chance or we're stepping outside the box that a lot of outdoor publications have tend to be comfortable in. And that's what we get a lot of feedback with people thanking for that.
I would agree with that. I would say that I would characterize it as feedback. It's not always sort of laudatory commentary or, you know, appreciative responses. I'm thinking back to, we did a long digital piece on Bears Ears National Monument and the pullback of the acreage that was in that designated monument. And I would say it was about evenly split. People loved that we were taking on a pretty hard-nosed issue and reporting it pretty deeply. And the other half said, you know, I don't subscribe to this to get New York Times-like reporting.
Yeah, and I don't mean to misrepresent the tenor of the feedback. We certainly got our share of negatives, but it's the negative commentary is usually, you know, comments on Facebook, comments on, you know, short comments on the website, or you get unsubscribes to the newsletter and people drop a comment there. But it's the detailed letters that people write where they actually express their thoughts. Those are usually people taking the time to express their thanks for the work, because we obviously agree it's lacking. I think the readers are aware of that too, and they're thirsty for it and appreciative of it where they can find it.
So I'll give you an example of something that's pretty topical. I mean, right now, in fact, my deadline for this piece is Friday. I'm looking at the presidential election through the lens of Sportsmen's issues. Mm-hmm. I'm probably 12 interviews deep into this piece right now, and it's not a piece that is particularly easy. It's not a piece that's going to be particularly satisfying, because I'll get into that in a second, but it is a piece I feel like we are obligated to cover. This is our beat. And as sort of painful as some of the reporting is, and as much feedback, I think it's going to actually be a huge content driver. It may only influence one or two, voters, because people have their minds made up so much in this political climate. But it's one I feel very strongly that we're obligated to cover.
I'm interested in reading that right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, to Chad's, so this is, I think, and Chad, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is one sort of dichotomy that you don't have to tread quite as I do. So it's interesting in terms of the reporting for this piece, and I think I have about 6 sources on each side for each of the candidates, Trump and Biden. Almost singularly on the Trump side, everybody is saying this is all about guns. Right. On the Democratic side, almost everyone to a person is saying this is about restoration of balance, and this is about making sure that we have rigorous environmental rules and regulations going forward. Now, there's some variations within that, of course, but those are kind of the 2 great dichotomies. And what's interesting about this is these are also the dichotomies that have sort of riven our world for 50 years. And I just see it now as really like almost everything else in the political environment is sharpening and becoming more shrill. But I can trace the origins to this discussion back at least as far as 50 years with, are you more interested in having a gun or having holistic, sustainable places to use that gun? I mean, and really that has defined so much of our population, and the readership of Outdoor Life and other, I would call them hook and bullet magazines for a generation, maybe more.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something we don't have to address as much in the work we do. But I imagine we'd agree that that's a false dichotomy that you have to deal with. And, maybe we have to ask ourselves, is that one of the failings of the outdoor media, that false dichotomy has been around this long, that it continues to persist, that we have to choose between sensible environmental regulations and guns? Is that a topic that we should be tackling more earnestly?
I don't know that it is a false dichotomy. I mean, if you've listened to any of the Supreme Court nomination hearings this week, this Heller decision that's the next Supreme Court's going to revisit, kind of is a fundamental, is the ability to own a gun, the right to own a gun, an individual right, or is it a collective right? I don't know that that's going to be decided right away, but that's a pretty big issue if you're a gun owner in America. I think the Republicans have done a masterful job of making this election all about that. And I think that part of the dichotomy is, if not false, it's at least skewed. But I don't think that people who say that, the guns are the only thing that matters, that guns are a cross in terms of sort of this religious sort of symbolism, are all wrong. I think they're exaggerating the risk. But if I'm being honest about my reporting, I think it's real. I don't think it's as real as the people who want to believe it to be is. But on the other side of it, and this is, again, I'm a moderate in all things and kind of a fence rider, I don't think the disasters of some of the rollbacks of the waters of the US are as dire as people are going to think. I think that was probably an overreach a little bit. So if we're being really honest, certainly in the West, where I hear about it all the time, we went way too far one way, and now we've gone way too far the other way in terms of rolling back all of these clean water acts and regulations. So at some point, and this goes back to that resource issues, to really get down to the absolute, bare wire of these issues. Honestly, even in this piece, I'm not going to have time to do that.
Right, and I think that, that highlights the need for this kind of work to be a more constant drumbeat rather than something that we're only able to do here and there along the way due to resources.
Trying to think of something to add to that, and I can't. I'm as a lifelong gun owner, I've never really worried about my guns being taken away, no matter what, what candidate was up for election. Actually, I've been a little more concerned about Trump's thoughts. I think he said something about taking the guns away first, and then he come back and do this legislation. uh, that was more concern to me than anything any Democrat has said, and not any Democrat. But I agree that it's been probably overblown on both sides. But I'm concerned that there is so much of the population that is that one issue voter. Now, I understand that the Second Amendment to people that think like that actually encompasses more than just guns. It's actually the barrier between them and a possibly tyrannical government. I understand that's a lot of the thought processes. That's a fundamental right on so many levels. Like you said, I fall into the camp of if we don't have a place to go, I don't understand what the guns are worth. Kind of like Leopold said, all this is for naught if you don't have a blank place on the map. It seems like also, and you can correct me, you said you've seen this, Andrew, you've seen this going on for 50 years, but doesn't it seem like you said, well, you also said it's gotten more shrill, but it seems like that single issue gun voter has become more prominent. Is that a symptom of the uncertain times we're in?
I think part of it comes to not only our failure as communicators, but our audience's failures to receive messages. It's a really easy message to receive to say they're going to come for your guns. It's hard to understand, like how national energy policy affects land leasing on winter range in the West.
Yeah, the threat out there that there's someone going to take your defenses away and you're going to be left helpless is again very visceral, very primal. So I understand that.
And I do feel like guns have become a kind of cultural placeholder to say, we understand guns. We're all for rural America. And I think that's been a really effective message. What's interesting to me is in the context of this piece I'm working on right now, I've just desperately looked for kind of a bedrock Democrat in those sort of Grange states of the northern Midwest, northern Minnesota, lots of rural Wisconsin, these places that really grew up with kind of a populist Democratic tradition. A person who came from that tradition who says, you know what, I'm voting for Trump because it really is all about guns. I can't find that person. I can find more people who say, I'm a recovering Republican and I can't believe that if, as a thinking hunter or angler in America, you would ever vote Republican because you're not voting for your interest, your self-interest. But I do want to get to that idea of much of what we're talking about here is a way to speak to rural America and say, we get you, those coastal elites do not.
I think all of these issues, this isn't something that just happens on the Republican side, right? I mean, this is the problem. Like we're sitting here talking about how guns have become to dominate, that entire side of the political aisle, specifically in outdoor media, of course. But, this is something that the Republicans do and have been doing for 30 years now on, whether it's guns or abortion or church and schools, things like that. Democrats do the same thing with identity politics on their side. Maybe part of the reason outdoor media is failing is because the audiences they're speaking to are less interested in these issues, and so we feel less inclined to cover them in the way that they demand. I don't know.
I actually think that's a very, very insightful comment. I would argue that hunters and anglers are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to recognizing the effects of climate change. So we pitched an entire issue of Outdoor Life last year related to climate change and really looking at some of these leading indicators that almost all of our audience recognizes. Where we got stuck on it was we really felt like our audience did not have the interest in they may recognize it, but they don't want to reach the conclusions that we were forcing them to. And so we sort of kept perpetually putting it on hold. Well, let's wait a year, let's wait a year, let's wait a year. I think now, more than 4 or 5 years ago when we started talking about this, I think there is more of an appetite for talking about this, more of a spreading recognition that it's
Sure.
real and impacting. But it is one of those issues that I think you're right to see or say is it's so complicated and so complex that that aptitude for consuming that kind of media is not nearly as strong as, how about another binocular review or a fly rod review?
I've read countless comments on both Facebook sites, Outdoor Life and Hatch, people say on any kind of even semi-controversial topic, I don't come here to read this. I come here to escape this. Again, what's still hard for me to wrap my head around is that all of these issues that we're talking about that need to be reported are absolutely vital to the continuation of these activities that we're enjoying. But like you said, though, that's a huge, big topic full of complexities and nuance that makes a lot of people uncomfortable.
Right. But I guess it comes down to, again, what you see as your responsibility. And certainly you could craft a publication that's job is to feed people's insatiable desire for rec porn, whatever that is, whether it's fishing porn or hunting porn or climbing, whatever, like all of that endless content of photos of big fish and gear reviews and all that. And if that is your mission, that's fine. I just don't know that it's a sustainable one, because as you said, none of this goes on for much longer if we don't draw attention to these issues. So on one hand, you've got just your moral obligation that you may feel from a personal level or from an organizational perspective. But from a business perspective, and I think a lot of the outdoor brands are realizing this, you're seeing a lot of the gear manufacturers, the apparel manufacturers you can see that tide turning over the years, that they're realizing that they have to invest in communicating the importance of these issues with their audiences, or they don't have a long-term plan. Because it's not like fishing or hunting or any of these things are going to disappear overnight. But I mean, the market grows smaller and smaller every year if we don't take the steps to protect it. And protecting it comes with informing the audiences that we're all privileged enough to have about the things that they need to know about, and not allow, as we're discussing, Republicans to shift the issues entirely to guns and abortion, Democrats to talk mostly about identity politics, other social issues, so that they can avoid entirely dealing with the difficult issues, whether those issues are climate change or economic issues or what have you, that, listen, we all know the deal has an obvious impact on the people that provide them with most of those campaign dollars.
So I do feel like it's our obligation to cover these for this main reason is I don't think that a lot of the readers who can benefit most from that nuanced discussion and having this in their sort of content stream are ever going to read it if it comes from Time Magazine, New York Times, Newsweek, because they've already arrived at they don't trust the source and they don't know who's telling the story. I think having strong identities within our world gives us an ability, but also the requirement to talk about hard issues, because our audience knows us as somebody who we're hardcore hunters and anglers and outdoors people. They're participants just like the readers are. So I think that when we do talk about these issues and we use our reporting skills to substantiate with quotes and background information what we're talking about, that we do have an ability to lead our audience to a conclusion. Maybe it's not the ones that we particularly are prescribing, but at least that we've brought them to become a more knowledgeable consumer and, advocate for these resources. So I think when we don't do that, and I look across the outdoor media landscape, and there are so many brands who never even wade into this world of reporting and our advocacy at all, because it is so fraught. But I think it is our obligation to do it because we are known people.
This is a great conversation. I didn't have to talk much, which made it even better. You just got to listen.
We are sportsmen, and we are in trouble. We've learned what happens when we underestimate a serious threat. We can't make that same mistake with climate change. We need to stand up for America and for our kids and grandkids. Tell Congress to act on climate.